This is Demetria Spinrad.
And this is Isaac Meyer.
And you're listening to Criminal Records Podcast, a podcast about some of the weirdest cases in true crime history. And I am excited about this one because Isaac has promised to really bring the weird today. And the communist arguments, I hear.
There's a little bit of communist arguing, but more international law arguing than anything else. But it is a buck wild story that deals with Cold War espionage, defection, high-level diplomacy, all that good stuff. But, Demetria, I have to start off talking about something far more interesting than any of that. Are you ready?
Far more interesting than this wild Cold War story? What is that? What could possibly be more interesting?
We have to talk about fish.
All right. Hit me. Hit me with these fascinating fish facts.
Well, so actually, I shouldn't say we're talking about fish, really. We're talking about fish law. Because there is actually a lot of legal wrangling around who has fishing rights and the right to fish in a given territory. Makes sense, right?
Oh, I was really hoping this was going to be some wild story about how fish have their own legal code.
I mean, we have our own legal code for fish. I imagine they don't have strong opinions on it one way or another. But in parts of American history, actually, we have cared a lot about fish. And in particular, the fisheries off the coast of New England, most prominently Massachusetts, but also I'm told there are some other states there that have a couple of ports on them, have been of great significance in American history for a long time. They were actually one of the attractions that brought European colonists to the region. And actually, here's a fun fact for you. There's a whole article, the very third article of the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Revolutionary War, that is just about fishing rights in that territory between Canada and the United States once America declared its independence. So it's very important.
Okay, so explain how this works to me, because my understanding of the ocean is that one can't really put a fence in it. The fish are going to go where the fish are going to go. The fish do not respect territorial boundaries.
That is absolutely true. And it actually was a major issue for a very long time in international law, is who has the rights to fish where and when. So much so that you may have heard of the cod wars between Great Britain and Iceland over fishing rights off the coast of Iceland. Future potential episode right there. But international law was actually very vague for a pretty long time on fishing rights and who had them. By convention, a lot of countries kind of relied legally on a 3 nautical mile limit from their own coast, which is 3.5 actual miles or 6.5 kilometers. Anything in that is still your territory, right? So your laws apply there. Only your fishing boats can fish there. And then past that, it's international waters. It's a free for all. Hell let loose on earth. No gods, no masters.
As I recall, it is also a fairly recent historical revelation, at least in the West, that you could fish out an area or hunt out an area, that God wouldn't just keep dropping more animals in where you needed them.
Yes, which is part of the reason why for such a long time that relatively tight kind of territorial waters convention is the standard. My understanding is that the concern is more about security and patrolling sea zones and policing than it is about maritime resources. But as there's more of an awareness that, hey, God's not just going to restock the deep sea fisheries for you, starting really in the 30s, there's a push to expand this definition of territorial waters. The other big reason is because people start finding oil on seafloors. And of course, they want some of that goodness. And more importantly, they don't want to share that with anybody else. So starting in the 50s, there's a whole bunch of UN-backed treaties that expand this 3 nautical mile limit to 12 nautical miles, which again, in real miles is 13.8. In kilometers, that's 22.2. But that's still not a lot of space, right? Legally speaking, most countries are very closely bound to their own coastline in terms of their territorial waters, which will actually become a big political issue in the United States in the 70s that becomes bound up with the Cold War.
Yeah, I would imagine only 13 miles off the coast, you have a bunch of Russian ships. That seems awfully close for comfort.
Absolutely. And people started to talk about that quite a bit during this period. particularly because those Soviets aren't just menacingly spreading their communistic ways, they're taking all our goddamn fish, Demetria. The communists are coming for our fish. They're redistributing our fish.
Those fish belong to good capitalists, good God-fearing capitalists. Well, they don't really belong to anybody. They are fish. But they should belong to capitalists.
Yeah, I mean, they're freedom fish. They might not know it, but they are. And this actually, in the 70s, becomes a bigger issue, but speaking of the war against communism, because of noted environmentalist tree hugger Richard Nixon. And of course, the thing we all remember Richard Nixon for, more than anything else, is founding the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which is the most important thing he ever did, and he'll never come up on this podcast again.
Yeah, that's what Watergate was about, right? That guy just really cared about water.
That sounds right to me. So one of the things the EPA does is actually start putting some limits on American fishing to conserve fish stocks. But other countries don't follow the rules of the EPA, and most of the New England fishery in particular is in international waters by the definition of the time. So American boats can't go in there and clean all the damn fish out, but those communist boats?
Those Ruskies are stealing all of our fish.
That they are. And in fact, this was a big enough deal that it made the New York Times. I found an amazing article from 1974 that I want to quote a little bit from for you all today. In 1960, the fertile fishing grounds of these waters were worked only by small boats out of New England and Canada. Now huge trawlers from afar, from the Soviet Union, Eastern European countries, and increasingly Japan, drag their nets deep here and dump their catches into factory ships for processing and freezing, harvesting so much they have decimated both the fish population and the New England fishing industry. 3 species of fish central to the Yankee trade, haddock, yellowtail, flounder, and herring, have been so depleted marine biologists fear they might not recover. For the consumer, increasing scarcity has in many cases driven the price of fresh fish higher than that of steak. All along the New England coastline, fishing is a dying business, and the salty fishermen and fresh seafood, as symbolic of the region as autumn leaves and church steeples, are becoming scarcer year and year.
Those fish are supposed to be turned into good American fish fingers, not whatever those wacky Europeans eat their fish as. I don't know. I don't know anything about Russian fish dishes. It probably is lots
something
of
with
mayonnaise.
Beets.
Yeah.
And I do want to note, first of all, that this article really leans into the anti-Soviet hysteria. Another quote I want to share with you. In seafood restaurants and fish stores in New England, posters have gone up reading, "The reason the price of seafood is out of sight is because they are catching everything in sight, the Soviet fishing fleet." Which I think someone thought that was very clever with the two out of sight, in sight, but it's not.
Okay, so I see that America is responding to this crisis in a calm and measured fashion.
Yeah, I mean, it's also the same article also notes that the Coast Guard keeps a tally of ships off of the American waters for obvious reasons. And there are a lot of Russians, 216 ships over the course of November 1973, 92 of them are Russian. But it's not just Russians. But because of the Cold War, the Soviet Union becomes kind of the poster child of all of this. It also gets wrapped up in some real weird domestic politics, where in New England, there's now this lobbying movement to just kind of unilaterally declare all those fisheries to be a part of America and, like, fuck everybody else, which is opposed by the State Department because they don't want to piss off the rest of the world, by the Defense Department because they're like, we don't want to deal with this, like, we're the ones who are going to have to patrol that. And then the California fishing industry also fought this because they fished off the coast of other countries and they didn't want to get retaliated against. So it became like a whole messy thing going on here.
Okay, so this is incredibly complicated because it is an international law issue, B, a maritime law issue, and C, it seems like individual states have their own individual priorities here. So sorting this one out is going to get very complex.
Yeah, this is why politics is the fun time it is. I do want to note that in our modern day and age, we have solved this problem. In 1982, we signed the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which doesn't let us annex the whole ocean as is our God-given right, but does extend a 200-mile nautical exclusive economic zone, which basically means like you don't own the water on top. There's no sovereignty, but you own the resources underneath. Which gives us control of the New England fisheries. So these days, right, we have claimed our fish in the name of freedom. But the story we are telling predates this sensible solution, and so the fish war is ongoing.
Okay, so we have this fish war, and if you are Isaac and you like your sashimi, fish is a dish best served cold.
Indeed.
So how is the Cold War going to impact the fish war?
Well, here's the thing. The fish stuff is all just predicate for like how we get into the weird position that takes us to our actual story here. Because the way we handled these problems before the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea was a series of face-to-face talks with the Soviets, right? Intended to work out basically deals around sharing the fishery that would just be one-on-one. And I assume because they wanted the god Poseidon to oversee all these talks, for some reason, these were just held on boats in the middle of the fucking ocean. Like, you're allowed to just talk about fish on the land. I don't understand why they couldn't just get, like, a hotel.
So all of the diplomacy, they go out into international waters to have
Not all of it, but, like, at least a substantial amount of it, yeah.
Like they're doing some illegal gambling out there. They just go out on boats.
I got nothing. But that's why... on November 23rd, 1970, there was a face-to-face meeting at sea between a Soviet fishing ship, the Sovetskaya Litva, and an American Coast Guard cutter, which is called the Vigilant. The two ships tie themselves together so that representatives from both countries can meet, they can go across ship, talk to each other, and, cut some fish deals.
Okay, this is already a wacky way to do diplomacy, but it seems to be working, so let's go with it.
All right, so this brings us at long last to our story and our protagonist. His name is Simas Kudirka, and he is a Soviet citizen, but in a somewhat awkward capacity. He's Lithuanian, and the name Sovetskaya Litva actually means Soviet Lithuania. Kudirka was born in 1930 in a village that I'm going to horribly mispronounce the name of, Griska, I think. To a mother named Maria Solskine, another name I'm sure I'm butchering here, at a time when Lithuania is an independent country. At the end of World War I, the three Baltic republics, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, which had been conquered by the Russian Empire, declared themselves independent when the Russian Empire's doing the whole Soviet Revolution thing. But that independence did not last. Because in 1939, super above-board guy Joseph Stalin signed a secret pact with Hitler to divide up Poland and also claimed the Baltics in the process, thus providing generations of work for online tankies who today flail about finding reasons why that was a totally okay and chill thing to do, because I guess the Poles are all revisionists or something.
It is my understanding that the warm embrace of communism was not a very pleasant process for these countries. Is that correct?
Yeah. It was also not a super voluntary process for those countries, because the year after the secret Hitler-Stalin pact, Stalin just kind of rolled the Red Army back into first Poland and then the Baltic states, because it's only imperialism if the Tsars do it. Otherwise, it's sparkling liberation. So Stalin would, of course, display his usual restraint and tact in establishing Soviet control of Lithuania, which is why, of course, today, after Lithuania has regained its independence since the fall of the Soviet Union, Lithuania and the other Baltic republics think so highly of Russia, and there's such a positive, warm relationship between them and the other states of Eastern Europe and their former Russian overlords. There's just so much love there. It's really beautiful.
Is that just a hint of sarcasm that I detect in your voice, Isaac?
If you measure love in armaments procurement, then there's a lot of love there.
Nothing makes great neighbors like great nuclear treaties.
If you ever want to have a really interesting talk, ask someone from Eastern Europe what they think of the Russians, and I'm sure they'll have a lot to say. I don't want to pretend as an aside here, by the way, the Baltic republics were like completely awesome before World War II. They all had issues with very authoritarian government before the Soviet invasion. Lithuania, I happen to be familiar with its history because I've taught it in the context of the Holocaust, has a really big Jewish population during the interwar years, which pretty much all died during the Holocaust, and the Lithuanians helped with that quite a bit. So, they're not a perfect place, but also like that doesn't make Stalin like a cool dude. Anyway,
Generally, countries do prefer to be self-governing rather than having empires roll over them.
true. But again, not really given a choice here, and so Lithuania is annexed as a Soviet republic into the Soviet Union proper. So there's a Lithuanian Socialist Republic, or Soviet Socialist Republic, I should say, that is a part of the Soviet Union. It's not an independent satellite state like Poland, so guys like Kudirka all become Soviet citizens. Kudirka also survives the war. His cousin actually was an anti-Soviet guerrilla and ends up in a labor camp where he dies. And decides that he wants to become a sailor. He says later to try and get away from the country he was living in, just have some freedom out at the high seas. But that might be him also reading, that's later stuff. He might be reading back into his own life. He will also get married at this point, a wife named Jeannie, and two kids, Lolita, a girl, and Evaldus, who's a boy. And, living the life of an honest fisherman until November 1970, when he's on the Sovetskaya Litva and he has this meeting with the Vigilant. So around 10 a.m., Kudirka comes up to the deck and sees the Vigilant. And at this point, the commander of the Vigilant, a guy named Ralph Eustace, he's given this, he's gotten this idea of throwing gifts over to the Soviet boat. Cigarettes, coins, magazines, hats, all that kind of stuff. The Soviets are throwing stuff back. It's, like a fun little exchange. Everyone gets set at ease a little bit. You get a chance to take some fun conversation pieces home. But Kudirka sees two of his Lithuanian colleagues pick up American magazines, which were, thrown over, and which, of course, showcase life in America in 1970 in all of its materialistic glory, and in particular, its higher standard of living than the Soviet Union. And so after they go below decks, he overhears a political officer who's seen them do this, basically saying to another officer, those two are never going to see again because they're unreliable. And now they've seen these magazines. They can't be trusted. They'll be seduced by capitalism.
So this fishing boat has a political officer on it monitoring the fishermen?
Yes, to make sure that they are politically reliable fishermen who don't try and, take the boat and just gun it for Iceland or something.
Honestly, I understand why that might be a problem for the Soviet Union at certain points in its history.
It certainly was for Kudirka. I'm going to quote here from his autobiography, which he, of course, would write later. I heard those words, and inside I blew up. They would be booked on voyages and then taken off at the last minute by border police without ever knowing why. They would always be threatened with the loss of their right to work, and for what? The instant they picked up those magazines, their lives melted into mine, and mine melted into meaninglessness. We were victims, all of us. We were trapped on a floating jail, and the idea of jumping to the American ship flashed into my mind out of nowhere.
Oh, so he's going to defect, huh? If he can just get to that American ship, because, okay, let me get this straight. So they're in international waters.
Yes.
So if he can get to the American ship, he is now in an area that, even though they're all in international waters, but he's going to be in an area that is under American control.
Yes, because like military vessels, which the Coast Guard is a branch of the military, they have jurisdiction over themselves. Like, doesn't matter if an American ship's in international waters, you can't just hop on board and be like, "You're in international waters, you can't stop me." Yes, they can. So once he's on board, unless the Americans say it's okay for the Soviets to come on, they can't come look for him. So sometime around 11 a.m., Kudirka is able to get the attention of the operations officer on the Vigilant, Lieutenant Doug Lundberg. His English is not very good, but he's able to convey the phrase, "I want political asylum." He also repeats the word Gestapo twice, according to Lundberg, presumably a reference to the political officer, the secret police. Lundberg passes this on to the XO for the Vigilant, Paul Pacos, who relays the message back to the Coast Guard offices in Boston and sends over someone to the Sovetskaya Lichka, where the captain, Captain Eustace, is in the middle of the discussion to recall him back to the Vigilant. So, now we go to Boston, right, where the headquarters for the Coast Guard 1st District, which is the part that has jurisdiction here. And things are a bit messy. First of all, because their cryptographic equipment is on the fritz at this point, so decoding the message from the Vigilant and responding takes a while. Second, this whole thing, just to give you a heads up, is going to take a while to unfold, and the person in charge at this point decides in the middle of it that, like, we're just going to treat this like a normal workday and close up shop at 5 o'clock and just stop responding for a couple hours at one point.
I mean, it's just fishing rights. It's not like they're going to be doing anything crazy in the middle of the night, right?
And to be fair, the guy who's calling the shots today is not who it normally would be. The person in nominal command of this area is Admiral William Ellis, who's a longtime veteran of the Coast Guard, but he is currently on medical leave. He's just had an operation for his hernia. So his chief of staff, Captain Fletcher Brown Jr., is the one in charge, right? It's not the person who's normally calling the shots. Brown is not used to this. And so he gets a message being like, oh shit, we might have a defection on our hands. What do I do? He's not used to being the guy who has to handle that. And so he does what I think is pretty natural. He phones home for advice. So he calls Admiral Ellis. Ellis says the Vigilant should not take Kudirka. If he tries to defect, do not take him. His later reasoning before a board of inquiry is that basically if we take him, that's going to torpedo our working relationship with the Soviets. But he'll also tell in an interview later that same year, quote, he, Kudirka, is a deserter no matter who he is. And I don't think I thought about the political overtones. If he did get aboard, we were going to have to, under any rules of decency, send him back. I figured that if one of my men had deserted to a foreign ship and I had been invited to go aboard to get him, I would have sent some people to get him. If this guy said he wasn't coming back, I'd have dragged him back. Ellis later claims that all of this is just advice to Brown, because he's on leave. He's not part of the normal chain of command, right? Brown just asked him for advice, and he says, I'm giving you advice. This is the advice, what I would do, but it's not an order. But that's not how Brown perceives it. Brown is like, this guy is an admiral. He's normally in charge. Ultimately, he's the one who's responsible for the district. If he says this is what I should do, that's an order from my commanding officer, so I have to do it. And so he relays what Ellis says back to the Vigilant, right? You can't take this guy.
So this is interesting because this is a case where the admiral almost seems to be more sympathetic to the Soviet officers than he does to the person who actually wants to desert. Is that correct?
Yeah, it would later emerge that Ellis was a Coast Guard guy who was not getting briefings about what was going on in the Soviet Union because that's not really his thing. And basically he was under the impression that, like, it can't be as bad as people say it is.
So he was just like, oh, who'd really want to jump off a ship?
I mean, not to sound judgmental about a man who did serve his country for a very long time and is now dead, but I get the impression that he was more of a gearhead and honestly kind of a fucking idiot. But, like, you don't need to be a master of international diplomacy if your job is mostly, like, making sure that the Coast Guard works.
In fairness, the Coast Guard's duties stop a little further from Russia. That's the Navy's job.
Traditionally, yes. So this all takes a while to get back, though, to the Vigilant, right? Because there's a big delay with the cryptography equipment. Meanwhile, by the way, the State Department doesn't actually find out this is happening until the mid-afternoon. And there's a lot of confusion about getting the information from the Coast Guard. They don't have a direct line to the Vigilant, so they have to do this weird tag game with the Boston office. And the State Department is its own train wreck in the middle of all of this. So back on the Vigilant, Captain Eustace is like, obviously I'm going to take this guy, right? He's a defector. I read the news, so I know what's happening in the Soviet Union. And so he starts trying to figure out a plan to get Kudirka aboard. The initial thought is that Kudirka is going to jump into the water and the Coast Guard will be like, well, we're the Coast Guard. It's our job to rescue people if they fall in the water. And they'll just send a boat, grab him, bring him aboard. But around 2 p.m., Kudirka tosses a pack of cigarettes over to the Vigilant with a note rolled inside it. And the note says, and I'm just going to quote from it directly, the actual text of the note. My dear comrade, will up down of Russian ship and go with you together. If is a possible, please give my signal. I keep a sharp lookout. Simas. The other side of the paper says, I up down in the time when the conference is end and your delegates go to your ship aboard.
All right. Okay. I'm presuming good enough for someone whose first language is definitely not English. How do they interpret this note?
Yeah, the interpretation is he's clearly planning on jumping over to the ship. He's not going to jump into the water. He's going to try and wait because they're both bobbing on the waves until the Russian ship is higher and then just jump directly from one deck to the other. Captain Eustace hears about the note, radios home again. This is still happening. What do I do? Waits for clarification. Doesn't get it. This is winter, and Boston is not as far north as Seattle is, but still decently far north. So night starts to fall a little bit after 4. Kudirka makes the jump between the ships around 4:30, and he makes it. Right? He jumps across, isn't spotted, lands on the Vigilant, immediately runs down a stairwell, and then things go to shit. Because he immediately runs into Ivan Burkall, the commander of the Russian shipping fleet, who is on the Vigilant for the conference. He's come over to the Vigilant to talk to them. And so Burkall is like, hey, Kudirka, what are you doing here? And he's like, I have to go, and then runs up to the bridge.
Okay, so the deserter is just running around loose on an American ship, which is under American control, but has Soviet officers on it. So who is actually legally in charge of him?
So technically, under American policy at this point, when he asks for asylum, we are supposed to grant it, right? That is the kind of policy of the United States.
We're supposed to grant
You're
it.
supposed to. There are then hearings and stuff that happens afterwards to determine whether asylum status is permanent, but you're supposed to give someone the option. And so that's what happens initially. Kudirka gets up to the bridge, and the bridge officers all welcome him, and then they shove him in the toilet. Specifically in the watchstander's head, which is a small toilet near the bridge. They figure just go in there, you're out of sight, and then, the hope is initially the Soviets don't know he's here. We'll wait to cast off when the ships split up. We just go. Easy enough. But now that's not viable.
So he's hiding in the toilet from the Soviet officer who knows that he's on this ship. And they're just thinking, all right, if we just sort of shove this guy in a spare room, the Soviets won't ask about him.
They don't know that the Soviets know he's there at this point.
Oh, okay. So, all right. So he's the only guy who knows that the Soviet officer knows he's on the ship.
Yes. But then it becomes clear when the Soviets when it's time for them to leave, and they're like, we're not leaving. You can't make us. And meanwhile, of course, there's yet more frantic radioing back to Boston. Captain Brown, the commander of the district, has at this point gone home for the night because he figured that if Kudirka was going to defect, he'd do it during working hours. And so immediately has to turn around and come back home, but is still relaying the orders from Admiral Ellis. He's also weirdly resistant to talk to anyone other than Ellis while this is happening, like someone from the State Department who specializes in Soviet affairs. And I just want to throw one more dipshit Ellis quote into here. I didn't and still don't feel there are any facts that the Russians go around killing people.
Oh, buddy. You have not turned on the TV in a while, huh?
So Eustace at this point is like, okay, well, I'm getting an order from my commanding officer, so I guess I have to give this guy back. And around 6 p.m. comes to the toilet to tell Kudirka that, who begins to panic and be like, they're going to kill me or send me to Siberia. Ellis is very sympathetic and radios back home 4 more times, but never gets a different answer. And around 8 p.m., the Soviets are still hanging around, and the political officer comes over and gives Eustace a note from his own commander. We know you have a defector. We know because of the broadcasts you've been getting back, which I guess they haven't cracked somehow, that you've been given instructions to hand him back over. And so give us Kudirka. They also claim that Kudirka stole 3,000 rubles from the captain of the Sovetskaya Litva, and that they want to kind of claim him as a thief. He's never searched for the money, and the claim is never verified.
Okay, so the Soviets just casually stroll over and go, so we were listening to your radio conversations. We've got some things to say.
To be clear, I know the Vigilant is broadcasting in code towards Boston. I'm not sure if Boston is broadcasting in the clear back.
They could be bluffing, or they could just be intercepting.
I just couldn't find clarification either way. But at this point, Eustace says, okay, I don't really have a choice, but I'm not going to order my own guys to grab Kudirka and bring him back. I'm not doing that. If you want to grab him, you can grab him. And so initially the Russians are hesitant to do this, but around 10:30 they decide to just force open the door of the watchstander's head and drag out Kudirka. It will take another hour for them to actually catch him. He will fight them. He will run around the ship like crazy. One guy who's having a real weird day out all this is Robert Briezi, who is a Latvian refugee who is at this meeting. He's now the president of the New Bedford Seaford Producers Association, and is feeling, as a Latvian, who's also, he got out, but he's seen this happen to his homeland, some kind of way about it, and tries to physically stop the Russians from attacking Kudirka and has to be held back. It gets violent. One of the Russians partially strangles Kudirka with a telephone wire until an American intervenes to stop him, and then slams his head into the stairs. Kudirka almost jumps off the ship to try and escape, but is stopped by some Americans. But eventually he is, around midnight, loaded onto the Vigilance lifeboat and shipped back to the Soviet ship, and then disappears from the American kind of radar.
Okay, so this is a really weird legal situation, because if I'm understanding this right, the Soviet officers not only arrested, but it seems like also tortured the guy that they were arresting on an American ship that is supposed to be under American control.
That is correct.
What on earth is the legality of that?
In the process of also grabbing a defector, and again, it's American policy during this point to take defectors and to grant asylum claims. Whether or not, how consistently that happens is iffy, but in the case of the Soviet Union, it's quite a bit, because it's very humiliating when someone defects from the Soviet Union. So the story breaks in the news the very next day, and holy shit are people mad at the Coast Guard. I'm going to quote from the Washington Post editorial board here. No more sickening or humiliating episode in international relations has taken place within memory than the American government's knowing return of a would-be Soviet defector to Soviet authorities on an American ship in American waters, which is somewhat of a reach, but the heart clogs in contemplation of this fantastic parabel of our times, which gives a sense of the energy of the time. I can think of a more sickening or humiliating episode in international relations, I'm gonna be real with you. But it's certainly pretty bad.
I will say this is about as bad as a peaceful negotiation over fishing rights probably has ever gone.
In the history of fishing rights negotiations, I'm pretty sure this is up there, though I haven't done the Cod War episode research yet, so we'll see. President Nixon also condemns the Coast Guard when he has a regularly scheduled press conference on December 10th. Someone asks him, and he says, as I've already indicated... Oh, should I try and do a Nixon voice for this?
Do it. Go for it.
As I've already indicated, I, as an American, was outraged and shocked that this could happen. I regret that the procedures of the Coast Guard informing the State Department and the State Department informing the White House were not adequate to bring the matter to my attention. I can assure you it will never happen again. The United States of America, for 190 years, has had a proud tradition of providing opportunities for refugees and guaranteeing their safety, and we are going to meet that tradition.
Damn, dude, that's a pretty good Nixon impersonation on a pretty grim piece of Nixon-related content.
Yeah, I don't think I really captured his mood in that moment, because it's hard vocal work. And I do it's very nice of Nixon to play up our tradition of accepting refugees. Again, if you know a little American history, that's not always the case. But it's a nice sentiment, I guess. It is also pretty unclear, by the way, what the White House knew about what was happening. It's pretty clear that not a lot made it past the Coast Guard while all this was going on. But it was pretty embarrassing for Nixon because he saw some pretty public discussion of the idea that Nixon actually was lying and had ordered this guy returned. As far as we know, he didn't. But the thinking was he just, cares more about the Soviet relationship than he does about some random fisherman. So this is kind of politically challenging for him, too.
So I'm curious. So it doesn't seem like they're treating this defector as if he has anything particularly useful to share about the Soviet Union. It seems like it's solely about public sentiment. Is
It's
that right?
very much a sentiment issue. I mean, he's not a high-level defector. Realistically, I don't know much about fishing tech, but I can't imagine their fishing is much higher quality than ours is. So it's very much about the symbolism, and not just for the U.S. government, because one of the groups who are the most pissed about this are Lithuanian Americans. There's a pretty big Lithuanian diaspora in the U.S. A lot of people who left Lithuania during the Soviet occupation, particularly in the Chicago area for some reason. And they are pissed off and put a lot of pressure on the government, actually, because of pressure from the Lithuanian American community. Many of the senior the senior State Department people involved in this are quietly retired. And the guy who was in charge of the Soviet desk, who was supposed to be answering his phone and helping deal with this, and who kind of fucked it up by not responding quickly enough, gets shuffled off to the Denmark desk, which is basically the end of his career.
I would imagine Denmark has a few things to say about fish, but they seem a little bit less politically urgent.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to make your career working on Denmark. More importantly for us, we do have some fun legal wrangling that comes from this. 2 different formal investigations. One is a military investigation, a board of inquiry in the Coast Guard, led by the second in command, the assistant commandant of the Coast Guard, Vice Admiral Thomas Sargent III, targeting Ellis, Brown, and Captain Eustace. The other is an inquiry by a House subcommittee on the State Department Organization and Foreign Operations. We often call this the Hayes Subcommittee because it's chaired by Wayne Hayes, who uses it to kind of inquire into the workings of American foreign policy. So, starting with the Board of Inquiry, this isn't a court-martial. The goal is to understand what happened, basically what unfolded with this incident, but under the rules of the Coast Guard, the implicated officers are allowed defense counsel from the Coast Guard Judge Advocate General. Again, it's a one-person board of inquiry who hears from a bunch of witnesses and then produces a report, right? So that takes until December 1970. It's pretty quick. It's just a couple of weeks. His findings are, first, holy shit, the Coast Guard needs a better way of working with the State Department. It is not good that they had this weird kind of telephone game. There needs to be clearer protocols for talking and clearer protocols for defection attempts. Captain Brown, the recommendation is that he should be court-martialed for dereliction of duty.
He was the guy who was trying to protect the defector.
No, he's the one who's in charge in Boston. He's covering for the admiral who's out.
Okay, so the captain is not literally the captain who was on the ship.
Yes, they're 2 different captains. So Captain Brown, who's the one in Boston who goes home for the day when he's like, defections happen during normal office hours. The recommendation is he be court-martialed because he didn't follow the chain of command. He goes to Ellis, who is out. Ellis is an admiral, but he's not in the military chain of command when he's on leave. So he's supposed to kick that up to the regular chain of command. He doesn't do that. He also doesn't hang on to Kudirka until he gets actual orders. He follows what Admiral Ellis says he should do, which are not orders, legally speaking.
So that's why they say he should be court-martialed, not for completely fucking this up, but because of a chain of command issue.
I think the idea is that because he didn't follow the chain of command, he fucked this up.
Okay.
That the report does also say this is a confusing situation, and so if you would rather just retire, if you'd rather just offer your resignation letter, you will be allowed to retire and there won't be a court-martial. Captain Brown takes them up on this. Admiral Ellis is reprimanded. He's not court-martialed, but he does get a formal reprimand for going around the chain of command and offering advice without actually knowing what he's talking about. That's literally he didn't familiarize himself with facts and policy before offering his advice. And so he's removed from command and he is advised to retire. And that actually gets rejected. The head of the commandant of the Coast Guard actually says, no, I want to court-martial Ellis. But Ellis then resigns to avoid being court-martialed.
I didn't realize you could get out of a court-martial by resigning.
I think the idea was that in this particular case, they wanted to, like, they were willing to let it go if he went away. I don't think you
Okay,
can normally just do that.
yeah, I thought normally a court martial is you don't get to decide to change careers and have
Yeah,
that
I
done
don't
with.
think that's normally how it works. But if you're an admiral and you fucked up the defection of a fisherman, we've all been there. And then we have Captain Eustace, who is, probably the most blameless in all of this, but he also gets reprimanded, specifically because he allowed the Russians to remove Kudirka via force from his ship. Allowing a foreign national to use force on an American military vessel, which the Vigilant is not kosher. You cannot do that. You cannot let another country's military or police come onto your ship and use force on someone else without very explicit orders. And so he is removed from command of the Vigilant. He's transferred, and eventually, a few years later, he'll take an early retirement. So that's the outcome of the hearing, or of the military inquiry. Then we have the congressional hearing, which takes a few more months. They released their report in February 1971. Pretty similar findings overall. It is built off of the Coast Guard report. Several of the members did read it. But the congressional hearing does also note there are some pretty big international law fuck-ups here. The Americans goofed pretty hard. For example, they're noting the precedent that the Russians do not have the authority to claim anyone in international waters. Right? They can ask. America doesn't have to say yes, and they can just sit in the Vigilant until they get tired. There's nothing really legally they can compel there. The report also notes that the claim Kudirka stole money was actually a huge screw-up the Americans could have flipped on the Russians. So, if the Americans had searched him and didn't find the money, that's fraud, and the Russians have now broken international law by lying to another country's government as part of what is functionally an extradition request. If Kudirka did have the money on him, then there's actually a legal procedure to follow. You take him ashore, you arrest him in Massachusetts, and then you open up extradition proceedings. There's a formal procedure that you have to follow.
Okay, in fairness, this is putting a lot on the Coast Guard, who don't usually investigate fraud, to know some complexities of the law that it doesn't seem like anybody in this chain of command actually knew.
Yes, which is actually the big part of the finding is the Coast Guard needs lawyers who actually know international law. That needs to be part of their kind of command structure going forward. But also, there is a finding that the U.S. government had violated its own legal agreements. We had broken international law, specifically the terms of the Convention relating to the status of refugees, which defines a refugee as someone who is, quote, owing to well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion outside of the country of his nationality, and is unable, owing to such fear, unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. Kudirka fits. And Article 33 of that convention says you can't return someone to a territory where their life or freedom would be threatened, right? If they are a refugee, you should not expel or refoul, is the legal term, them back to a country where they would be in danger. We broke that by sending Kudirka back. We did violate the terms of the convention relating to the status of refugees.
Okay, so the U.S. has confirmed that they broke the law, but I mean, this guy's probably in a gulag, severely, severely mistreated, if not dead by now. So what on earth is the U.S. actually able to do about it at this point?
Realistically, at this point, not much. These are all just reports for future policy changes. And yes, Kudirka, it doesn't go well for him. He's arrested by the KGB, shockingly, put on trial for treason, shockingly, and actually charged with violation of Article 64 of the Criminal Code, undermining the Soviet system. If you remember the Operation Wedding episode, that's the same rule that those people were accused of breaking.
Yeah, that's one of the big ones. You don't want to break that one.
Yes. He does get offered a deal by the KGB. They say, if you will confess to your crimes and blame, and this is a direct quote, bourgeois Lithuanian nationalism for what you did, and say you've converted from that belief, you'll be tried under Article 83, which is illegal border crossing. Not quite as serious. He says no. His trial takes place May 17th, 20th in Vilnius in Lithuania. And Kudirka, when the trial starts, dismisses his own defense counsel. He gives a speech saying, if my lawyer is competent, he's just going to get into trouble too. And if he's just a plant for the government, then like, fuck him, I don't care. More eloquently than how I phrased it, but that's the notion. And Kudirka spends the whole trial basically defaming the Soviet Union for their actions in Lithuania, clearly hoping there's obviously no free press coverage here, but that some report of what he's saying will get out. And so, shockingly, he's convicted. And
honestly, I have mad respect for this guy. I mean, if you're gonna go down, what a way to go down.
Yeah, I mean, I gotta respect it. He did pay for it, though. He gets 10 years in a labor camp and confiscation of all his property. He's not killed, but that's not a charitable thing. They just don't want to make him a martyr, clearly. And so instead, the hope is that he'll just be disappeared.
10 years in a labor camp is a pretty good way to die.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, well, it's a pretty bad way to die. It's a pretty good way to kill your political prisoners without actually sentencing them to death.
But here's the deal, Demetria. We're not done yet. We're not over. Done? There's one more insane legal twist here.
Wait, okay. Obviously, the U.S. can't come and get him Bridge of Spies style. So what
that's what you fucking think. Twist? Here we go. So Kudirka becomes a big, an issue in the Lithuanian American community. There's big protests, right? There's a lot of support around kind of trying to bring him back to the U.S. Again, especially in Chicago, where there's this big Lithuanian American community. And there's also a lot of Lithuanian Americans who spend a lot of time digging into Kudirka because of his new celebrity. As a result, one of the women engaged in activism around him, whose name I'm gonna fuck up here, I apologize, Grazina Paigele, but she uncovers something very interesting. In March of 1974, she finds records that Kudirka's mother, Maria Sulskiene, was not born in Lithuania. She was born in 1906 in Brooklyn. And she has a baptismal certificate, which proves this, which means, Demetria, we have to talk about the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of these United States of America.
Is this going where I think it's going?
I think it is. So as we all know, Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, the first sentence says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. This was created after the Civil War to protect freed former slaves during the Radical Reconstruction period, basically legally enshrining in the Constitution that if a formerly enslaved person had been born in the USA, they are an American citizen. No state can pass a law challenging that. But what it also means is if you are born in America, you are an American. That's just it. So Maria Sulskiene is an American citizen, unless she's renounced her citizenship, which she hasn't.
And the child of an American citizen
is also an American citizen in some but not all cases.
So, when the Soviet officers went onto an American ship to arrest a Lithuanian who they thought was a Soviet citizen, they were actually arresting an American citizen?
Yes, and because he's Lithuanian, America doesn't recognize him as a Soviet citizen. We never recognized the annexation of Lithuania. For legal purposes for the United States, the Soviets do not control Lithuania. Lithuania is just like a country, on ice, waiting to come back. So, for legal terms, we don't say he's a Soviet citizen. He's not a dual citizen.
Wow, okay, so now we're in a really weird situation where he's been sentenced under the laws of a country that America doesn't recognize as having the power to sentence him, but these Soviet courts, are they going to recognize him as an American citizen?
Well, there's a little bit of complexity here first, because proving he's an American citizen is challenging, because he was born in Lithuania, and the rules are a little different there. So the rule is that a child of two American citizens is automatically an American citizen. If you and your partner are American, you have a kid somewhere else, doesn't matter, automatically American. Kudirka's mom is American. His dad, we're not quite sure. So there has to be some research there because the rules vary depending on the citizenship of the second parent. But what emerges, a little bit scandalous after some research, is that Maria Sulskiene was unmarried when she had her son in Lithuania. Right? She had him out of wedlock, which is probably pretty hard to deal with if you are a young unmarried woman in a heavily Catholic country. But under the laws of the US, that means that only her citizenship status counts in terms of determining the citizenship of her son. So because she is unmarried when she has him, he is an American citizen as long as she's lived in the US for a year, which she has.
Wow. Okay. This is a truly wild twist, but is it actually going to matter at all for him? Because he is still stuck in this prison camp.
Well, there's a lot of challenges for all of this, because at first, the first thing the Pagula family actually tries to do is get in touch with Maria Solskene, who's still living in Lithuania when this is all happening, and trying to figure out, like, is this true? Are you the person who's showing up in all these certificates? They call her in Lithuania, which is a thing, you could do. It was very expensive. And eventually she says, yes, that's me. It takes her a while because she's convinced at first this is a KGB trick. But then when they're able to confirm, oh, this is the right person, they say, you're an American citizen. Go to the American embassy in Moscow, right? They will help you. They will get you out of the Soviet Union. And she tries, but she's actually detained by the KGB. First, she's stopped from getting onto the train to Moscow. And then when she eventually gets there, she's almost arrested by the KGB. It turns out they keep officers outside the American embassy and will go after suspicious people who try and enter, including some American citizens. It's a whole big to-do that emerges as a result of this. But eventually some Soviet dissidents manage to get her into the embassy. And so she is, she's now safe. She's in the embassy. That's American territory. The Soviets can't go in. So what about Kudirka? So this becomes a lot messier, right? On July 18th, 1974, the U.S. government officially announces, we say Simas Kudirka is an American citizen. So this is no longer a failed asylum claim or an internal issue on the Soviet side. An American citizen was kidnapped while trying to return home. He was illegally detained aboard an American vessel. And we don't stand for that kind of shit.
Well, we did stand for quite a lot of that kind of shit. But in this particular case,
no. Legally, we don't stand for that kind of shit. So the result is a lot more negotiation between America and the Soviet Union. But at first, it doesn't really go anywhere until another player enters our story. Best known, of course, for his time at the University of Michigan as a football center and linebacker, a guy named Gerald Ford, who was somehow the team MVP in 1934 when the team only won one game, which I don't know if I'd be proud of that, but, that's still nice. I think he was also president at one point. I think that's right.
I didn't let anyone be president.
Yeah, it was the 70s. It was a loose time. And he decides he wants to resolve this issue and basically goes to the head of the Soviet Union, Leonid Brezhnev, and is like, do me a personal favor and let Simas Kudirka go. Not for any advantage, just do me a solid here, Leo. And amazingly, Brezhnev says, okay. To establish good relations between the two of us, to have a good working relationship, I will do this for you. I will personally intercede to get this done. Henry Kissinger would later give an interview saying, basically, any trained diplomat would never do this. They would never just hand that much leverage to someone to cash in a favor over something that insignificant. But what he says is Gerald Ford was just a really nice dude. And so he just wanted to help this guy out.
I know that in Kissinger's mind, saying someone's a nice dude is the biggest insult ever.
So on August 31st, 1974, Simas Kudirka is released from prison and allowed to go back to Lithuania. In September, he's allowed to travel to the U.S. by the Soviet government and to take his wife, his kids, and his mom with him. So when he gets to the U.S. on November 6th, he's received in Chicago, the beating heart of the Lithuanian American community. There's a big old party. He gets the keys to the cities, this whole thing. And just this massive celebration, I actually found an edition of the newspaper of the Knights of Lithuania talking about his release. And basically, all the regular articles, the ones that aren't just announcements and stuff, are just about him. This is a big deal. He's wined, he's dined, he's meeting with interviewers and talking about the horrors of the Soviet system. And just this whole kind of, very, it's a big deal. His later life is a bit less exciting. I found out about this story from an excellent documentary called The Jump that interviews him. They have interviews with him after he came to the U.S. And he basically, from what I remember, became an apartment super at one point. And there's a great interview where he's talking to someone from a news network, and they're asking, like, how are you finding life in America? And he says, oh, it's so great here. You can even find great, like, even your trash is better than the Soviet Union. And basically, it comes out over the course of the interview that his whole apartment, including the couch that this very fancy reporter is sitting on, are like trash like things from the trash he'd picked up. And he's just so, like, he's so old country, like, it's so nice. Why would I not, like, it's so good. And the reporter is just mortified. It's amazing.
I mean, I guess it is pretty mind-blowing if you grow up in not just the Soviet Union, but one of the areas that the Soviet Union has pretty brutally repressed. And then you move to a city where people are throwing out the kinds of things that Soviet citizens are paying ridiculous amounts of money just to smuggle in.
It's pretty wild, yeah. I mean, that's the thing, like, one thing I really got, like, reading interviews with this guy and, you know, you just seeing archival footage of him talking, he just really loved America. Like, he was very, like, kind of impressed by the freedom to say what he wanted to say and by, like, the quality of material life here. It was really, like, honestly, genuinely very touching. Eventually he does leave the US. In 1990, Lithuania becomes an independent country again, and in 91 the Soviet Union collapses. In 2010, Kudirka does go back to Lithuania, missing the land he grew up in. His English becomes good, but he's never fluent in the way he's fluent in his native language. And he decides he wants to live out the rest of his life there, which he does until he dies in 2023. His kids still live in the US, though. He just is like, I want to go back to Lithuania. And that's the story of Simas Kudirka, a guy who just, you know, jumped off a boat because he loved freedom.
Honestly, man, I'm glad that he got his freedom. That dude really deserved his freedom.
Yeah, it's a really interesting story because when I was, like, digging into this, there was a lot of press coverage from the initial moment, and obviously when he gets sent back to the US, that's a big thing too. But the people who spent the most time on this were, like, ethnic Lithuanian Americans, for obvious reasons, and then the, like, batshit right-wing people, like Phyllis Schlafly's organization put out so many press releases about Simas Kudirka. And it's this weird story that is a confluence of kind of the domestic American political battle. You know, it's the 70s, this period of kind of losing faith in the American dream, and you have this guy who really wants to come here, and isn't that, like, a symbol that we've still got it as a country? And then, you know, tied up in all of this Cold War insanity where we care a lot about, you know, not looking weak in front of the Soviets. And then this just hilarious pile of coincidences where this guy who tries to defect is actually secretly American the whole time.
Wow. Yeah, I was not expecting a story about international fishing rights to go in quite this wild a direction. This is probably the broadest swath of laws that we've ever had to cover in an episode, because we got from fishing rights to who is responsible for what goes on a ship criminally, to the Coast Guard court-martial process, to constitutional law.
Yeah, it's been a wild journey, and never let anyone tell you because of it that fish law isn't interesting.
All right, you've changed my mind. Fish law is super interesting. This is probably the most interesting criminal fish case that I've ever heard.
And if anyone else out in the world has thoughts on future fish crimes that may or may not relate to international asylum law, where can they find us?
You can find us at facingbackward.com.
You can also find us at patreon.com/facingbackward, where you can join the network of fantastic supporters who give us resources and money to spend on investigating fish crime.
And special shout out to our patrons who pledged at the shout out tier. You are Ian Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCullough, Kieran Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William, Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, an anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sy, Gil, Leslie Ikuda, Trash Taste Enjoyer, John, Christopher, Harrison Rees, Inoue Enrio's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shmal Toshio's History of Japanesia podcast, Jennifer Pianzo, James, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. And unfortunately, Isaac, I do not have any more fish crimes for you, but I actually did find Soviet fruit crimes. So look forward to that.
Oh,
We're
yes.
going to get deep into communist arguments about fruit.
All right, the neglected supermarket side of the Cold War. Just in time for the 4th of July.